Hello and welcome to the David Icke videocast. And what a week of hysteria it has been in Britain over alleged anti-Semitism in the British opposition Labour Party, and particularly targeted at its leader, Jeremy Corbyn. The horrors of Nazi Germany should not be forgotten. The unspeakable, unimaginable treatment of Jews and communists and the disabled by the Nazi regime was almost beyond comprehension. But there's something else beyond my comprehension. How people who didn't suffer in Nazi Germany can exploit the suffering of those who were there to pursue an agenda today of the deletion of freedom of speech and the deletion of any criticism of the far-right apartheid regime of Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel. Because that is what ultimately this hysteria against Jeremy Corbyn and the British Labour Party is all about. It should not be forgotten either that Jeremy Corbyn came to power as leader because of an organisation within the Labour Party called Momentum. Momentum was created by John Landsman, James Schneider and Adam Klug, all of them Jewish. And now we are being asked to believe that Corbyn, who has actually shown himself to have no backbone in response to this, by the way, is some kind of evil symbol of anti-Semitism. What he has done, and this is the point, and what many in the Labour Party do, is to challenge the behaviour of the Netanyahu regime in Israel. But it's much, much wider than this, and I'm going to get into the very wider aspects of this as we go along. You can see the orchestration of this anti-Semitism hysteria in league with the pathetic mainstream media. Oh, pathetic and mainstream media. God, I repeat myself. And you can also see it in the fact that some of the people most targeted by these ultra-Zionist zealot groups are Jewish people. The Labour Party has been suspending Jewish people over claims of anti-Semitism, brackets, criticism of Israel and support for the Palestinians. And there's a reason why Jewish people are particularly targeted by these ultra-Zionist zealot groups when they challenge Israel. Because it's very easy, and so many people fall for it all the time, it's very easy to dub someone who's not Jewish an anti-Semite, a racist. By the way, anti-Semitism, Semitism relates to a language group in the Middle East, or language groups, and the overwhelming vast majority of those groups are Arabic peoples. Even the very name is a misnomer, the very label. But it's easy, you see. He's an anti-Semite. Yeah, he's an anti-Semite. Evidence? Evidence? Well, we don't do evidence anymore. He's an anti-Semite. But it's much more difficult to dub Jewish people anti-Semitic But my God, bizarrely, they actually try. And they call them self-haters. We've got to have some hate. Where would we be without throwing hate in all directions? And so you have Jewish activists challenging the behavior of Israel, and Netanyahu targeted most viciously of all by these ultra-Zionist zealots, because it's not about anti-Semitism. It's not about stopping racism. It's about using that as an excuse to exploit, so that your agenda of deleting freedom of speech so people can't say what you don't want, and criticism of Israel is no more. And where this has been going, and is going even more every week, is to equate criticism of Israel and Zionism with anti-Semitism. And because of that, they can dub Jewish people anti-Semitic. And we should not forget this. In a global population currently around 7.5, 7.6 billion, the number of Jewish people in the world numbers 16 million. Many of those 16 million do not support Zionism. In fact, some vehemently oppose it. And most of the others that support Zionism, which by the way is not a race, it's a political philosophy. You're racist now if you oppose a political philosophy. Where are we? Well, we know what we are. Opening the door to 1984. And most of those that support Zionism, of the 16 million, do so on the basis of supporting the existence of Israel, which they have every right to do. But what, in my experience anyway, most of them do not understand, is that there are actually two Zionisms. And the other Zionism, known as revisionist Zionism, is the one in control of Israel and the Netanyahu regime. Revisionist Zionism, which was the work of a man called Jabotinsky, thought it fine and completely okay to use violence to reach your end goal, which is what, of course, is happening all the time. And one of Jabotinsky's close associates who worked very closely with him, the father of Benjamin Netanyahu. This is not about protecting Jewish people from racism. Everybody should be protected from genuine racism. I don't have a racist cell in my body. I find racism ludicrous. If people look at my philosophy on life, that we're all consciousness, the same consciousness, having different experiences, then to self-identify with race, never mind judge someone else by it, borders on insanity and certainly confirms a complete misunderstanding of the nature of reality, the nature of who we are. So my philosophy on life and reality is the ultimate non-racism, because I'm saying we're all the same consciousness, just having different experiences. Race, what's it matter? But race and racial divisions are used to divide and rule the target population so that the tiny few can get what they want. Now, I'm going to come in a second to how this definition of anti-Semitism has been expanded and expanded to take in more things. Extraordinary story. But first, this is a former Israeli government minister, the late and great Shulamit Aloni, who stood up for Palestinian rights on the basis of just simple justice, just simple fairness, just simple humanity. And she spoke on an alternative TV program in America some years ago now, and explained how the brand everyone you want to silence anti-Semitic scam works. Have a look at this.
Yours is a voice of criticism we don't often hear in the United States. Often when there is dissent expressed in the United States against policies of the Israeli government, people here are called anti-Semitic. What is your response to that as an Israeli Jew?
Well, it's a trick. We always use it. When from Europe somebody is criticizing Israel, then we bring up the Holocaust. When in this country people are criticizing Israel, then they are anti-Semitic. And the organization is strong and has a lot of money, and the ties between Israel and the American Jewish establishment are very strong, and they are strong in this country. As you know, they have power, which it's okay. They are talented people, and they have power, money, and media, and other things. And their attitude is Israel, my country, right or wrong, the identification. And they are not ready to hear criticism. And it's very easy to blame people who criticize certain acts of the Israeli government as anti-Semitics, and to bring up the Holocaust and the suffering of the Jewish people, and that justify everything we do to the Palestinians.
So that, clearly explained, is what is actually going on with this hysteria against Corbyn and the Labour Party. And if he had any backbone, he would actually stand up and say so instead of getting down on his knees. And the way this whole thing works is that there is a global network of groups. I call them ultra-Zionist hate groups, and I call them hate groups because their modus operandi is to get the public to hate their targets, and their targets increase all the time. I'm one of them. And so every country, in the West anyway, but particularly countries like America, Canada, Britain, and others in Europe, have these groups going under different names, but working to the same agenda. And that is to use anti-Semitism as a slur to silence any opposition to Israel, those that are trying to advance the boycott of Israel, the BDS, on the basis of Israel's behavior towards the Palestinians, and to basically delete free speech in general, because this is part of a much bigger picture than just what is happening to the Labour Party. And Al Jazeera television, the Arabic station, did a series called The Lobby, where they used hidden cameras to film, secretly, obviously, people involved in this lobby in Britain, to expose how they worked and manipulated through political parties, including the Labour Party. And in one of the scenes, a operative with the Israeli embassy in London was caught on film talking about the takedown of a government minister and causing problems, basically, for people who in politics were saying things that Israel didn't want them to say. And on davidicke.com, the posting of this video there, underneath I posted the links to this series, The Lobby. Now, I mentioned earlier that the definition of anti-Semitism has been widened and widened, and it's taking in more and more things that are not anti-Semitic at all. And it started out with an organization called the Holocaust, or the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. This is an organization, of course, dominated by Zionists and Zionist groups, and also, apparently, those wonderful, truthful, honest people, Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, were helpful in its creation. Anyway, in 2016, this organization developed, and it's been accepted by governments now, a new definition of anti-Semitism, which basically has changed the game. And this is the upfront definition, but the devil's in the detail, and I'm going to come to the detail in a second. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, towards Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. Now that's the upfront definition. Now the detail. This Berlin-based International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance equates in its detail criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, criticism of Zionism with anti-Semitism, because what it says is this, and these are a series of examples of anti-Semitism based on that definition that it has produced with the definition. Contemporary examples of anti-Semitism in public life, the media, schools, the workplace, and in the religious sphere, could, taking into account the overall context of that definition, include but not be limited to, because there are no limits to what they can dub anti-Semitic or hate speech. It's just what they decide it is, so that you don't have limits in your definitions. You want a cup of tea? Anti-Semitic. Coffee? Anti-Semitic. Cake? We're heading down that road. And so these are the examples that they provide of anti-Semitism now. Making mendacious, dehumanizing, demonizing, or stereotypical allegations about Jews as such, or the power of Jews as collective, such as, especially but not exclusively, the myth about a world Jewish conspiracy, or of Jews controlling the media, economy, government, or other societal institutions. You'll notice that facts that you can produce have no relevance whatsoever. Truth is, and facts are no defense against this definition of anti-Semitism, because suggesting it, no matter how much you may support what you say, is anti-Semitic in and of itself. Now, this is not about protecting Jewish people from anti-Semitism and racism. It's about protecting everyone in the Zionist lobby from exposure for whatever they may do, because whatever you expose them doing, if it's not nice, is anti-Semitic by this definition. It's protection. It's not about stopping racism, it's protection. In fact, these things can add to anti-Semitism because people wrongly dub what the few do with what all Jewish people do. That's the ludicrous nature of it. The potential is to make anti-Semitism worse, not better, as some Jewish people have pointed out this past week. And so making mendacious, dehumanizing, demonizing, and etc. allegations, the myth of controlling this and controlling that, controlling government. But what about the guy from the Israeli embassy who was caught on hidden cameras calling for the takedown of a government minister in Britain? Another one, accusing Jews as a people of being responsible for real or imagined wrongdoing committed by a single Jewish person or group, or even for acts committed by non-Jews. Now that is an outrageous statement, because the very opposite is the case. What happens is if you highlight some manipulation or what it calls wrongdoing by a Jewish person or a Jewish group, you are not saying that means all Jews are the same. Absolutely not. It's a ridiculous thing to say. But what happens is these ultra-Zionist hate groups then dub you anti-Semitic for having the audacity to highlight one Jewish person or a group for manipulation or wrongdoing. The Rothschilds. The documentation of the manipulation of the world by the House of Rothschild, since it was created back in Germany, is enormous. Some members of the Rothschild family have come out and said it. But you talk about Rothschilds. You might talk about other bankers and banking families that are not Jewish, but you talk about Rothschilds and anti-Semitic, which is the very opposite of what they're saying here. Denying the fact, scope, mechanisms, e.g. gas chambers, or intentionality of the genocide of the Jewish people at the hands of the National Socialist Germany and its supporters and accomplices during World War II (brackets the Holocaust). Now, were Jewish people disgustingly treated by the Nazis in Germany? Of course. But that's not the point here. The point is that we are having it dubbed racist, and indeed, in many places, it's a jailable offence to question any aspect of an historical event in this case. Well, you may know better than me, but I can't think of another historical event in all human history where questioning any detail of it is A, a jailable offence, B, considered racism by definition. And this is not about, you see, what happened in Nazi Germany or any of that. That's another area of debate or perception. It's about what it says about freedom of speech and freedom of opinion, that it's a jailable offence, or you're dubbed a racist by definition for questioning any aspect of an historical event. Whatever event that is insanity, surely. in what is alleged to be a free society. But that is a definition of anti-Semitism. Accusing the Jews as a people or Israel as a state of inventing or exaggerating the Holocaust. So, no one has ever said anything about what happened in Nazi Germany, who happens to be Jewish, that is open to question or debate or query. What, no one? Ever? That's what this says. Because you can't question anything. Otherwise, it's a definition of anti-Semitism. I mean, let's just take a deep breath and look at this from the wider picture without the hysteria. Accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel or to the alleged priorities of Jews worldwide than to the interests of their own nations. That is an example given in this new definition of anti-Semitism of anti-Semitism. So, again, we are saying or being told we have to accept that no Jewish person anywhere in the world puts the priorities of Jewish people ahead of the priorities of the country they are living in. Or not one single Jewish person in the entire world is more loyal to Israel than the country they are living in. Are we saying that? What, no one? But you point out that there is evidence to suggest that this person or that person does put loyalty to Israel above the country they're in. And you are, by definition, an anti-Semite. This is the madness that we are dealing with. Applying double standards by requiring of Israel a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. Well, what about demanding of Israel that which is expected and demanded of democratic nations, like not having an apartheid racist state in which you have second-class citizens treated very, very differently to the ruling group? Drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. So, revisionist Zionism has concluded that it's okay to use violence to reach your end. A revisionist Zionist, Benjamin Netanyahu, is in power in Israel. And we have a racist apartheid state in which the Palestinians are treated so disgustingly it's almost incomprehensible. But if techniques used by the Nazis are used by the Netanyahu regime and its military against Palestinians, you cannot say that, even with evidence, because it's anti-Semitic. And you might gather, as I go through these new definitions of anti-Semitism since 2016, that this is not about protecting Jewish people from racism and discrimination. It's about protecting Israel from any exposure, any criticism. The final one, holding Jews collectively responsible for actions of the state of Israel. Well, that would be ridiculous to do because it's not true. But when these ultra-Zionist hate groups and the revisionist Zionist extremists in Israel make their public statements, they claim to be speaking for all Jewish people, even though they're not, and nothing like. And so this expanded definition, and watch for the expansion creeping, I'll get to that as well because it's already doing so, means that, as we've seen in this hysteria about Jeremy Corbyn this week, which came out of him putting something on social media supporting an American street artist known as Mir One, who was pointing out that his mural on a wall in London depicting bankers living off the backs of the oppressed masses. Talk about telling the truth, eh? That's not true? Are you having a laugh? Corbyn put something on social media saying, basically, yeah, support that it shouldn't be removed. And now, because of this hysteria, and it's all orchestrated, someone's found that comment by Corbyn and said, look, he's supporting anti-Semitism. Because what they are claiming is that this group of bankers living off the backs of this oppressed majority masses were depicted as Jewish people. Well, of course, the artist, Mir One, was misrepresented completely in the media. Well, again, I repeat myself. So he wrote an article for davidicke.com saying actually what it was all about. And he pointed out that these bankers were representations of the Rockefellers, the Morgans, and the Rothschilds and others. But because the Rothschilds were Jewish, that is anti-Semitic, even though he was talking about bankers. And we've also reached the point where someone who, whether you find the joke funny or not, made a joke with his dog. And the joke was founded, the very point of the joke was founded on the fact that the Nazis were horrible people. He's been convicted of a hate crime for anti-Semitism. Comedy's dead. It's been destroyed by PC and all this stuff. And so few comedians have the backbone to take it on. Few do, but not many. Now, what we are there for looking at is this gathering expansion of imposition by the few on the many. And this week, in the wake of this hysteria, Jeremy Corbyn offered to meet these representatives of the Jewish groups, not necessarily the Jewish community, by the way, not a misnomer, representatives of these Jewish organizations, which followed all this, these attacks on him. And these groups, one of them is called the Jewish Leadership Council, and the other one's called the Board of Deputies of British Jews. They came back to him with a letter, which is just extraordinarily sinister, and basically is demanding the takeover of how the Labour Party is run. I'm going to go through, because what they say here is, no, We're not going to meet you, Mr. Corbyn, until you accept our terms for a meeting. And these are the terms. Like I say, sinister doesn't even begin to cut it. It says there's no point in a meeting if the situation remains the same or continues to worsen. In this spirit, and to enable a meeting to take place, we propose an agenda of actions for discussion. First one's headed leadership. The party leadership, and you personally, they say to Corbyn, must be seen and heard to lead this work. You must do what we say. Only your voice can persuade your followers that this is a necessary and correct course of action. If actions need to be passed by the NEC or other party bodies, you need to take personal responsibility for ensuring this happens. You are the leader of a British political party with aspirations for government, but you will do what we say, not what your members say. Anti-Semitism disciplinary cases, of which there are increasing as this witch hunt in the Labour Party goes on, with many Jewish people, Jewish members of the Labour Party, subject to that witch hunt for reasons I've explained. It says outstanding and future cases of disciplinary actions to be brought to a swift conclusion under a fixed timescale. An independent, mutually agreed ombudsman should be appointed to oversee performance, reporting to the party and to the Board of Deputies and the Jewish Leadership Council. This is a takeover demanded of a major British political party with aspirations to government. Relations with suspended members that have been suspended after allegations, often with no evidence, of anti-Semitism. These people say MPs, members of parliament, councillors and other party members should not share platforms with people who have been suspended or expelled for anti-Semitism. And constituency Labour parties should not provide them with a platform. Anybody doing so should themselves be suspended from membership. In the case of MPs, they should lose the party whip. So we demand that we decide what happens in the Labour Party and who Labour Party local branches give a platform to. Education. Every time I read the word education, in almost every context, what I see is indoctrination. Anyway, just me. The party should circulate the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism with all its examples and clauses, that which I've just gone through, to all members and branches. The party should work with mainstream Jewish community organisations to develop and implement education about anti-Semitism. This should include a clear list of unacceptable language, such as the use of Zio or Zionist as a term of abuse, based on the full IHRA definition and on the examples included. But the political philosophy is called Zionism. People that support that political philosophy call themselves Zionists. But if you say Zionism is doing this or that to these people, like the Palestinians, then that is anti-Semitic. And you see, again and again, what is the recurring theme here? In relation to the Labour Party, but also in relation to the wider world. Equating anti-Semitism and seeing it everywhere for that very reason with questioning and challenging the behaviour of Israel and the political philosophy of Zionism. No, the heading, process. Oh, we must have a process. These changes must be sustained and enduring, because we say so. There needs to be an agreed process to monitor the progress and implementation of these actions. To conclude, your personal pledge to be a militant opponent of anti-Semitism and to always be our ally are vital statements. To always be our ally. What? Whatever you do? Well, you can't criticise us. Well, whatever we do, that'll be anti-Semitic. The situation demands it, they say. No, you demand it. And we would expect nothing less. You do surprise me. In this light, there's an urgent matter that we need you to address. People inside and outside the Jewish community are repeatedly subject to abuse and insults for raising the issue of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. And people like me, now Corbyn, and so many Jewish activists, are continually subject to mendacious abuse and misrepresentation, lies in other words, by ultra-Zionist hate groups trying to silence us. But it's that great line. It's okay when we do it. Frickin' hypocrites. And it goes on that those Labour Party members and Labour supporting blogs pushing the abuse are largely doing so in your name, Mr. Corbyn. They need to hear you say publicly and in your own voice. Well, how's he going to say it in someone else's? I'm not sure. Anyway, maybe he's a ventriloquist. That we have every right to protest about anti-Semitism. Yes, you do. But not to represent or misrepresent people who are not racist as being so, because it suits your bloody agenda. And that Labour MPs have every right to support us, that our concerns about anti-Semitism are sincere and not a smear as has been widely alleged. I mean, would I even suggest that? And that anyone directing abuse, intimidation or threats, but abuse, intimidation and threats by the ultra-Zionist hate groups against activists and people like me, that's okay. Because it's okay when we do it. Because we're different. Why? We should all be the same. We should all be treated the same. Anyone directing abuse, intimidation or threats at those of us who oppose anti-Semitism is damaging your efforts to eliminate it and to start rebuilding trust. We firmly believe that this must happen urgently and certainly before we meet. And it's signed Jonathan Goldstein, chair of the Jewish Leadership Council, and Jonathan Arkush, president of the Board of Deputies of British Jews. And what is that saying? Jeremy Corbyn, get down on your knees. And it's been very disappointing, I would say, to see that Jeremy Corbyn has basically done that instead of pointing out that criticism of Israel and criticism of the extremes of Zionism, particularly revisionist Zionism, is not anti-Semitic. Speaking out for a deeply oppressed and appallingly, disgustingly treated Palestinian people is not anti-Semitic. It's basic frickin' humanity. And so we have these groups within a network that are working together to oppose questioning and challenging of Israel by using the weapon of anti-Semitism. And we're talking a ridiculously few people compared with the Jewish population, small as it is at 16, 17 million, in a world of 7.5, 7.6 billion, the people who are actually doing this are tiny compared with the Jewish population in general. And just to give you an idea of the concentration of power over not just censorship, but surveillance now. Of course, Facebook has been big time in the news in recent days because of the exposure of the way that the personal data of Facebook users has been abused disgustingly. And as I've been pointing out for years and years and years, all this social media, Google stuff, it's just a surveillance operation. It's a data gathering operation, and not just for advertising either, by the way. But let's look at these two companies that have been focused upon in recent days. Facebook, Google, and Google-owned YouTube. And so let me look at the control system of these companies. Facebook, Google, and YouTube are run and controlled by 5 Israel-supporting Zionists. Facebook's head and CEO is Mark Zuckerberg. Facebook's chief operating officer is Sheryl Sandberg. And they run Facebook. Google was founded by Larry Page and Sergey Brin, who now run the parent company of Google, controlling Google, called Alphabet. And YouTube, owned by Google, is run by Susan Wojcicki, who is the sister of Anne Wojcicki, the former wife of Google's Sergey Brin. And those 5 people, as has been pointed out, not this part of it, but the organizations in general, Google, Facebook, and YouTube have a colossal impact, fundamental, front line, biggest impact on what people see and don't see today. And of course on the surveillance that goes with it. As I said in last week's video cast, Google, YouTube, and Facebook, with others, represent the greatest concentration of surveillance and censorship power in human history that the world has ever seen. And ultimately, 5 people are calling the shots, at least officially. But there's more. These 5 Israeli supporting Zionists are employing ultra-Zionist hate groups like the Anti-Defamation League in America, which came out of the Rothschild-created B'nai B'rith, Sons of the Covenant, and the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is nothing to do with poverty. It's vastly rich and has been exposed for putting its millions in offshore accounts. It's employing those, or those companies are employing those ultra-Zionist hate groups to advise them on what should and should not be censored. And what has been happening in recent months? YouTube channels giving an alternative narrative to the official one have been deleted and deleted and deleted and deleted. for no reason. Oh, you've gone against our regulations. Well, what are your regulations? Well, whatever we decide they are, so we can delete you. It's so blatant. And this is moving on and moving on and moving on. This is from my new book, Everything You Need to Know But Have Never Been Told, to show how far this is going. The next inevitable extension of censorship, I write, came with the announcement in 2017 that the notorious Anti-Defamation League, which ironically goes around defaming people, talk about inversion, the ADL, was planning a state-of-the-art command center in Silicon Valley to monitor everything online that it decides is hate. Of course, the definition of that goes wider and wider all the time. And the very creation of hate crime was manipulated into reality by the ADL. The definition of hate, I write in the book, is this context. Anything that criticizes Israel and anything the ADL decides hate is hate because its censorship suits the agenda. ADL Chief Executive Jonathan Greenblatt revealed the establishment of the new censorship center, and never want to exaggerate, he is quoted as comparing the alleged growth of anti-Semitism in the United States to that of Nazi Germany. Oh, you can make comparisons with Nazi Germany then, as long as it's okay with you. The centre will use the, quote, best-in-class technology, according to Greenblatt, to provide insights to government and policymakers. Yeah, I bet it bloody will. Pass that through the Orwellian translation unit, I write, and it becomes to tell the people what information and opinion they can and cannot circulate. And if we come back to Britain, the same's happening here. There's two groups in Britain that I'll highlight. One is called the Northwest Friends of Israel, and the other one is called the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, or the CAA. And they both came into, the CAA, by the way, is one of those targeting Corbyn and the Labour Party now. And it's also, or both groups have tried and consistently try to silence me and to delete my ability to speak in public, even though British people want to hear it, because what they want matters. And I'm someone who says we're all one consciousness and racism is ridiculous, childlike, and stupid. But truth doesn't matter. Slurs matter to get the outcome you want, which is silencing people saying things you don't want them to say. Anyway, the CAA and the Northwest Friends of Israel both came into being out of nowhere in the summer of 2014, while the British public was being appalled and disgusted by the mass, merciless bombing by the Israeli military of Gaza in Operation Protective Edge, an operation that killed 2,256 Palestinians, including 500 children, and injured 17,000. But don't point that out. It's anti-Semitic. And this is what the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism says. And it came out of nowhere, funding from private donations, and suddenly it's walking the halls of power, meeting people like Theresa May. Anyway, we have forged links, it says on its website, with the government, local authorities, regulators, police forces, and the Crown Prosecution Service, as well as with companies such as the major social networks. And what are these links, I wonder? We meet at the highest levels to tackle the roots of anti-Semitism and ensure that the law is upheld effectively, consistently, and firmly. And surprise, surprise, this is what it also says. Google and CAA agree to collaborate on cleaning up YouTube as CAA starts recruiting volunteers for YouTube cleanup squad. Anybody wonder why YouTube channels are being deleted? Google and Campaign Against Anti-Semitism have agreed to collaborate on cleaning up anti-Semitic hatred, which is whatever we say it is, on YouTube, with Google granting us access to special content flagging features. Have you got them, for your opinion? No, nor me. Videos that we report to Google will go through a fast-track reviewing process, following which Google may take the video off YouTube or place a number of limitations on it, such as removing it from video suggestions and making it harder to find, ghost banning as they call it. Once a video has been identified as promoting anti-Semitism, brackets, because we say it has, because we say it is anti-Semitic, by that ever-widening definition, Google will use its algorithms to recognize the video if it is uploaded to YouTube again using a different user account. Whilst we may not always agree with Google about what should be on YouTube, this is a very promising collaboration, oh, I'm sure it is, which we hope will enable us to work with Google to reduce the amount of anti-Semitic material, brackets, whatever we say is anti-Semitic material, appearing on YouTube. We are now building a volunteer team to help us to flag videos which should be reported using the special reporting features supplied to us by Google, but not to you and me. If you would like to join the team, please go to, and all the rest of it. You know, if there were proper journalists around, anyone remember them? There's still a few. God, what a nightmare it must be if you're a proper journalist working in the mainstream media today. Anyway, if you had some proper journalists, they would look at the CIA and they would say, okay, you came out of nowhere in 2014 amid the bombardment of Gaza, okay. And now you're walking the halls of power, and now you're working with YouTube to delete videos and opinion and free speech. You're trying to stop that David Icke bloke from speaking in public by telling the venues a load of crap about what he's going to say. Who are you? Who funds you? What is your agenda? But instead, no, the media, including the BBC, just have them on and they let them be quoted to say whatever they want. And it's called freedom of expression and a free press and a free media. They might also ask this question: how can the CIA be so involved in the deletion of free speech, the silencing of opinion, and targeting political parties, and still be a registered charity with all the benefits that come from that? Anyone in the media think that might be a question worth asking? Just no? So, let's look at the other side of this. Facebook labels Palestinian journalism hate speech. Facebook is defending its decision to shut down the page of a major Palestinian news outlet, describing the action as a move against hate speech. The social media giant closed without warning, it's always without warning, the page of the Safa Palestinian press agency, which had 1.3 million followers, as well as Safa's account on the photo sharing Instagram, which, like WhatsApp, is also owned by Facebook. Zuckerberg. The Palestinian Media Association condemned Facebook's widening assault on the free speech of Palestinian journalists, calling it clear submission to the policies and dictates of the Israeli occupation, which is pursuing Palestinian activists on the basis of their political views and intellectual positions and issuing prison sentences against them. Surely not. It's the only democracy in the Middle East. By referring to hate speech and incitement as justifications to silence journalists, Facebook has adopted the framework of Israel, which routinely uses such broad and ill-defined terms to describe virtually all criticism of its violent military occupation over Palestinians or its state ideology, Zionism, which is not racist even though it has Jewish-only settlements, Jewish-only streets, Jewish-only this, Jewish-only that. It's not racist. Anti-Semitic to say it's racist. The company did not respond to a question about whether it had taken action against Safar based on a request from Israel. But the Intercept website's Glenn Greenwald, who's a very respected journalist who actually just care about the truth, the Intercept's Glenn Greenwald had previously written and spoken about Facebook's collusion with Israel and the United States to silence voices they don't like. See Labour Party now in Britain. Facebook has repeatedly demonstrated its willingness, at times bordering on eagerness, to curry favour with powerful governments by deleting content they don't like, Greenwald said. Goes on, one of the countries to which Facebook has proven itself to be most subservient, Greenwald says, is the Israeli government, and as a result it has engaged in a year-long censorship spree against Palestinians whose crime is that they express views and engage in activism that Israeli officials don't like. Brackets, see Labour Party in Britain now. Since the beginning of the year, Haaretz, the Israeli media newspaper, says, citing an unnamed Palestinian activist who monitors the issue, that about 500 Facebook pages of Palestinian activists and journalists have been closed by the company. And according to Greenwald, Facebook has empowered Israeli officials to control its content by obeying their censorship dictates in almost all cases. Brackets, see the Labour Party now. See me now. And just last week, Justice Minister Ayelet Shaked, and if you want to talk about extremism, go onto a search engine, put in Ayelet Shaked, S-H-A-K-E-D, and see some of her quotes, if you want to see extremism. Justice Minister Ayelet Shaked praised Facebook for its actions against Palestinian accounts. She said terror organizations, because that's it, if you're not anti-Semitic, you're a terror organization if you're criticizing Israel. Terror organizations have moved on to operating on Twitter instead of Facebook, Shaked said in a conference in Jerusalem. The reason is because of the fruitful cooperation between Israel and Facebook, i.e. Facebook does whatever we tell them, and the lack of cooperation between Israel and Twitter. But you won't have to wait for long. According to Shaked, the Justice Ministry has asked Facebook to disable some 12,351 Palestinian accounts for their alleged connection to terror and incitement to violence. And what we're seeing now is the further expansion of the definition of anti-Semitism to anyone saying, even with the enormous evidence that I, for one, produce in book after book after book, and some of them ain't small, to say the least, that anyone, no matter what the evidence, exposing the fact that a few people, through a global web of interconnected organizations, is directing, transforming, controlling human society, which becomes more obvious by the day, then they are also anti-Semitic. So now these ultra-Zionist hate groups are talking about tackling fake news, deleting conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theory, conspiracy theorists, a term brought into widespread use by the CIA to discredit people who were questioning the official story of the Kennedy assassination, are now used on anybody who is questioning the official narrative, supported, of course, by the ludicrous media. So this is not, even where we are now, with the events of this week in the Labour Party, this is not where it's meant to end. It's meant to continue until anything that you say that doesn't support the official narrative is either racist or supporting terrorism or whatever other excuse they come up with. And like I say, it's been very disappointing to see the backbone deleted response to all this by Jeremy Corbyn, when he should have been looking it in the eye and calling it out for what it is. And I would say to Jeremy Corbyn, as I would say to the wider humanity, human race, get off your frickin' knees while you still can.